Shall we start?
Sure.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Jenks Center. My name is Vera Austin, and I'm the chair of the Jenks Education Committee. Today, we welcome Michael Tougias for a presentation on Mayflower to King Phillips War. Michael is a New York Times bestselling author and co-author of 30 books for adults and 7 for children and young adults. Among his bestsellers are The Finest Hours, which is a Disney motion picture version that opened in 45 countries in January of 2016, Fatal Forecast, Overboard, King Phillips War, and There's a Porcupine in My Outhouse, The Vermont Misadventures of a Mountain Man Wannabe. Michael lectures across the country on each of his book topics. He also offers leadership, inspirational programs for business groups, and has spoken to companies and organizations such as General Dynamics, Raytheon, Massachusetts School Library Association, New York University Surgeons Roundtable, and many more. Before we begin our presentation, please join us in thanking the John and Mary Murphy Foundation, whose generous grant is making this program possible. Please welcome Michael Tougias.
Thank you, Vera. Hi, everyone.
You're welcome.
Hi there.
This period in history has always fascinated me, and I think I got that love from my father. He was a baker, never went to college, but boy, he loved his history. And I grew up in Longmeadow, Massachusetts, in the western part of the state, and that was one of the towns attacked during King Philip's War. So I used to see the signs everywhere, King Philip this, King Philip that, and I said to my dad, who the heck is this king? And he goes, oh, it's a Native American that they called King Philip. His native name was Metacom. So that led me to this first book that you see on the screen. This is a historical novel about the war where the lead character is fictional, but all the events are true. And then with co-author Eric Schultz, together we did the history of King Philip's War. And Eric was the lead writer. He did way more work and research than me. He was really brilliant. And I've been fortunate. Both books have been in print now for many years. And sometimes people ask, oh, are you part Native American? I go, no, I don't have a drop. And if I did, I'd be a Pequot because they own Foxwoods. But I've just been interested in this part of history that seems to be overlooked. So if we go back to the beginning with the contact with Europeans, you could see where the tribes were located before we moved in. And some were really hit hard by disease, particularly those coastal tribes like the Massachusetts tribe. And this would be even long before the Pilgrims, when you had explorers and fur traders introducing these diseases. And they kidnapped a few Native Americans as well. So things were off to a bad start even before the Mayflower came. And the natives were agricultural-based people. They were not nomadic. That's what they call the Wetu. We call it the wigwam. And you see the grinding stone out front. They would pound the corn to cornmeal. And this is my friend Stanley holding this, archaeologist who's passed away, but he was a great help during the research. And this is one of the axe heads that Stanley found at a dig site. The natives would cut down the big white pines and hollow them out for dugout canoes. So here in southern New England, the natives would use dugout canoes primarily. Northern New England, where they had the big white birches, would be birch bark canoes. And here Stanley's demonstrating one of the natives' first inventions. It's called the Atlatl, or the throwing stick. And this is before the invention of the bow and arrow. So when he brings his arm forward, he doesn't let go of the handle of the throwing stick, but the spear goes flying off it in a trajectory. He's made me a bunch of these, and one day I took one to a football field, and standing at one goalpost, I could almost hit the other goalpost. I mean, it's that accurate. Just he liked to say this was man's first step to the moon. And a friend of mine, Wes, an Abenaki Indian I met, and I put this slide in to mention that when we do get to the King Phillips War part of the presentation, the natives did have muskets. They'd been trading pelts for muskets and, you know, steel implements. And they would utilize every aspect of an animal's body, like even the deer antlers, you could use those to flake an arrowhead.
Patient visitor drop off pickup.
And the moose, one of the books I used in the research
There you go.
was the
There she is.
New England Prospect. Someone's microphone is on. I think if you could please mute it, I could hear someone in the back. But so you can find the book New England Prospect oftentimes in the library. A new
Hi, how are you?
updated edition has
Yes.
come out. We need someone to mute their microphone. I can hear talking going on. But okay, can you hear me now? Yes, good. And in that book, New England Prospect, he says there's this great beast in the New World, and we call it the moose, and it's going to plow all our fields. They never did domesticate the moose, but you could see why he said that. This is back in 1630 when William Wood wrote that book. You know, it looks like a horse with antlers. Natives would raid muskrat lodges like this and reach inside to get the roots for their own use so that they could eat them, and then they'd repatch the top so the muskrat could survive the winter, and then they could do it again. So when the Mayflower came over, they weren't even trying to come to Massachusetts. They were trying to go south. They hit some storms and decided they better pull up into not Plymouth, but Cape Cod at Provincetown. And I mentioned, so the storms kind of threw off their intended destination. But while on board, they did agree to, I guess you could call it like the seeds of democracy, that most of the people on board, both the what they call the saints, the religious group on board, and the outsiders that they called the strangers, signed a document saying we're going to work cooperatively when we do land. And you know, one of the issues was when they came ashore, they'd have to come ashore in the shallop, the small launch, and then they'd get out and they'd get wet. And they're arriving here, you know, right on the edge of winter. So not a good time to try and build a settlement from scratch. And as I said, they landed in Provincetown first. So that was the first landing in November. What's today's date? Must be pretty close, the 9th, so pretty close to today they landed. And one of the reasons they did not settle the Cape was they had discovered some Indian corn buried at, we think, what's a burial site, you know, in a woven basket, and they took it back to the Mayflower. And Bradshaw wrote in his diary, we plan to compensate the natives. But the natives didn't know that. They just knew their corn was gone. So they attacked the Pilgrims at first encounter. And that was one of the reasons the Pilgrims got back on the Mayflower and said, well, we can't settle here. So they pushed on to Plymouth, which had been settled by the Patuxets, a sub-tribe of the greater Wampanoags. But they had been killed by disease, and the Pilgrims thought, oh, this is a sign from God. There's some fields that are, you know, partially cleared. But God had nothing to do with it. Disease had everything. The fields were cleared by the natives. And so that's why if you go to Provincetown, there is a Pilgrim Monument. I always wondered, why is there a Pilgrim Monument in Provincetown? But when you learn Pilgrims spent several days in that area, you know why. And so they land at Plymouth and it's cold and there's a lot of work to do. They have no shelter. They're running low even on food. And again, you know, this far in the season, you've got snow to deal with. There's no doubt in my mind the winters were so much tougher back then. Even during King Philip's War, the snow amounts written by some of the survivors of King Philip War, just astronomical snow amounts here in New England. So if you were to take a walk around Plymouth, you'll see this sign for the first burying ground. And one of the things the Pilgrims were doing in those early months is many of them were dying. Almost half the Pilgrims died the first winter. They knew they were under observation by the natives, and they didn't want the natives to know that they're being decimated and their numbers are decreasing. So they would bury their dead at night so the natives couldn't see just how many were getting sick and dying. And then in strolls two natives, Squanto and Samoset. They had the blessing of the great leader Massasoit. And I really believe if it wasn't for those two natives helping the Pilgrims, they would not have survived the first 12 months because they showed them how to plant the corn, how to catch the shad and the herring. And they were surprised when one of them said, "Welcome, Englishmen," in English. But he had been one of those natives kidnapped by an early explorer, made it all the way to Europe, somehow all the way back, and then rejoined with Massasoit's people. So he knew some English. And so he was the perfect interpreter to be between the English and the natives. So this monument you see to Massasoit, his native name, by the way, was Osamequin, which means yellow feather. Massasoit is not a personal name, that's a designation of a great leader. So when you hear the word Massasoit, it means great leader, but his real name was Yellow Feather. And ironically, when we get to King Philip's War, Metacom was Osamequin's son. So it's the father who allowed the Pilgrims to get established, and it's the son trying to drive them out. So Eric and I, we wanted kids to know the real history and not sweep it under the carpet. So we did 2 issues of Cobblestones magazine. And then, you know, today's Native Americans, they look at Thanksgiving very different than we do. They call it a national day of mourning, that basically Massasoit's decision was the beginning of the end. And so this is the plaque they put up in Plymouth to give a little different take on the same holiday. So you had a period of relative peace. It wasn't totally peaceful. Miles Standish did ambush some natives that he thought were going to turn hostile against the Pilgrims and slayed them in a trick. But by and large, it was peaceful all the way from 1620 to 1636. And that's when the Pequot War happened in Connecticut. The Pequots were a very powerful tribe. There'd be some issues over trade. The Pequots killed one of the traders that they said was stealing, and Mass Bay and Connecticut decided to come down and attack the Pequots in Connecticut. And this was a sketch done of the attack on the main village. And so the Pequot village was behind that palisaded walls, and the eyewitnesses said the wigwams were lined up as if they were on streets. And in the outside, you'll see the soldiers firing the muskets. It's like a little smoke or flame coming out of the end of the muskets. But then you said, what are these natives on the outside ring with the bow and arrows? Those were friendly natives to the English settlers, and they were mostly Narragansetts taking advantage of this fight against the Pequots. So the the overwhelming message I got in all my research was the downfall of the natives was that the tribes could never unite, all throughout American history. If they only united, they did at the very end, Custer and the Little Bighorn, but it was too late. So the Pequots were hit in a total surprise at that main village down in Ledyard, Connecticut. Here's another sketch of the attack. The attackers went in and just, leveled the village. And those Narragansett allies were shouting, "Enough, enough." They had never seen total warfare like this. You normally wouldn't annihilate another tribe. You would just conquer, and then they would pay you tribute over the years. So they were shouting, "Enough, enough." So this kind of shows the attack there. The green arrow shows where Captain Mason was taking some of the Hartford settlers to attack the Pequots. He looped up into Narragansett Bay and got some of the Narragansetts to attack with him. And then where you see that red flash by the Mystic River is where the battle occurred. And so now they've subdued and beaten the Pequots. It's called the Pequot War, but the whole thing was over in a matter of 3 months. So I don't even consider it a war, nothing like King Phillips War. But that allowed the settlers to really expand. It sent a message to the natives: if you oppose us, here's what's going to happen. So they were digging ditches like this one to drain out low-level areas so their cattle could go in and feed on the marsh grass. And they were building mill sites like this one. This is down in Whitford, Rhode Island, the Gilbert Stuart Mill. It's a beautiful place if you ever want to take a Sunday drive. And they built the town commons. This is Grafton, one of the more beautiful ones. And there was always a fence around the town common because that was common land where anybody could bring in their sheep and cattle at night. I laugh at this picture because there's my daughter. I don't know how old she is. Say she's 5. She's now 33, living in London. But I used to take her on the research trips. The natives had something besides land that the settlers wanted, and that was the beaver pelt. So there was an active trade going on between natives and English people. And this is one of the trading posts. You can visit this. It's on the Cape Cod side of the Cape Cod Canal in Bourne, just, maybe 100 yards from the actual canal. And then in front were the stocks. So, while the Pilgrims were pretty strict, the Puritans who settled Mass Bay Colony, they were even more intolerant. For example, if you were a Quaker and you spoke up too much about your religion, they would put you in the stocks. And if you kept speaking up, they'd penalize you and they'd kick you out of the colony. And so many went down to Rhode Island, where Roger Williams had a more open society. So that's why you see Quaker meeting houses along the Mass Rhode Island border and through Rhode Island, but you don't see them west of Boston because they were kicked out of Mass Bay Colony. There were some attempts to convert the natives to Christianity. One occurred here at this is right below the South Natick Dam on the Charles River. And the experiment was going pretty good. It was led by the Reverend John Eliot. The natives were farming, living in houses like the English did, could speak English. But you jump ahead to 1675 when King Phillips War broke out, and the colonists were so terrified of any natives, even these neutral, what they call praying Indians, the Indians converted to Christianity, were rounded up and put out at Deer Island, kind of like what happened in the US during World War II with Japanese Americans put in internment camps. That's what happened to these praying Indians. And many died from exposure out on Deer Island. So we've got to the spring of 1675. Massasoit is long since been dead, and his son Metacom has taken over leadership, and he sees the handwriting on the wall that if we do nothing, we're going to lose all our tribal land. So he's trying to align other tribes with him in this uprising. And some of his warriors, I think, jumped the gun. It wasn't time yet because he hadn't convinced the Narragansetts that, you know, taking up arms was the way to go. And people often say, what did Metacom look like? And nobody did a sketch of him while he was alive, but this interpretation was one of the best I saw, a sculpture made of bronze by Phil Cote. And it's a lot better than some of the sketches done, you know, maybe 50 years after the war. So his home base was the Mount Hope Peninsula in Bristol, Rhode Island. And that was the same home base for Massasoit as well. In like Bradford's diary, you read how Winslow went out and met with Massasoit there at Mount Hope, and then later Metacom took over. And there's some land owned by Brown University where there's this ledge of rock, and they call this King Philip's seat. And legend has it that he would sit where I'm sitting there and address the tribe. And it's, you know, it's very plausible that that's exactly what happened, because it feels kind of like a stage. And Native Americans go there today to hold their celebrations. So when Until I Have No Country came out, they invited me to the celebration, and I asked, could I take photos? And they said yes. So it was a good experience for me to meet these descendants of the Pokanoket band of Wampanoags. One of the triggers that started the war was the death of John Sassamon. He was working for the English as an interpreter. He could speak both English and the Abenaki language, which was the greater language in New England. And he was killed, and we don't know the circumstances, but the English claimed that it was Metacom's people that killed him because they suspected him of being a spy. And so they rounded up 3 of Metacom's aides, put them through a trial, found them guilty, and they hung all 3. And I really think that was the tipping point where Metacom realized, you know, the English rule the land, their laws govern, not ours. We need to fight. So if you're a native, you know, it had to be a tough decision, you know, because they probably knew it's going to be a huge gamble to take on these powerful English that have muskets, although some of the natives did too. And by the way, England never sent any troops to help the colonies. So if you hear me say soldiers, I'm just talking about militia from towns that were in existence then. So they'd be farmers trying to protect their land and go after the natives. And so Metacom's smart enough, after some of his warriors jumped the gun and attacked the town of Swansea, he doesn't want to stay at Mount Hope because it's a peninsula and he'll be trapped there. So he takes his people across Mount Hope Bay and into this area known as the Pocasset Swamp, which is in modern day Tiverton and Little Compton, Rhode Island. And then Benjamin Church comes walking in this scene here from left to right through that field area. This was known as the peas field because peas were growing there. And he walks right into an ambush set up by Metacom. And Church was lucky to escape with his life. And it would have behooved the Indians to kill Church because he became a very effective Indian fighter. He learned always take friendly Indians with you when you're, you know, going out looking for the natives to fight, so you don't walk into an ambush. And Church later wrote an entire book about his experience, so it is a good eyewitness source. And he was friends with several natives who stayed loyal to the English. So there's a little bit of balance in it, unlike some of the other books from the period. And he's buried right on the town common at the edge in Little Compton, Rhode Island by the church. This is his Benjamin Church's family plot. And that's one of the beauties of New England history. A lot of the sites that you'll see as we go through the war are still open to the public or in open space protected. Here's where the natives burned down one of the garrison houses. So a garrison house is I guess you would call it like a safe haven if your town is being attacked. Go there and there'll be extra food, extra ammunition. But here the natives in Dartmouth, Mass were successful in burning it down. This is what's left of the foundation. So the red arrows show Metacom's movement in the first few days of the war. He crosses the Mount Hope Bay. There's that fight with Benjamin Church, but then he heads up towards central Massachusetts. And the reason he does that is he's heard that the Nipmucks, a totally different tribe on their own with no coordination from him, have attacked and burned the town of Minden, which is where I live. And so he's got an ally. He's got another tribe. So it's very likely, Montauk, by the way, that's the native name from Mount Hope. And Montauk means the high place. So he probably came up the Blackstone River because that would be a natural, kind of like a highway, if you will, heading towards modern day Brookfield. This is one of the many King Philip overlooks. This one's looking down on the Blackstone River. And when he arrives here at the Ware River in central Mass, the Nipmucks are celebrating because they've done another attack, and this time they've burned down Brookfield. And the way that attack occurred is there were soldiers stationed at the garrison, and they were ordered to set up a meeting with some of the Nipmucks from the big village at the top of the screen. That was called the Winnamesset Village. And make them sign a peace treaty before this war gets out of hand. And when they go to the meeting location, there are no natives. Some of the soldiers smell trouble. They want to get back to the garrison, but people from Brookfield, there were 3 people from Brookfield there. They said, no, we know these natives, everything will be fine. Let's march right into their village. Big mistake. The natives were prepared if the soldiers were going to come into the village, and they sprung an ambush, and Captain Wheeler was shot off his horse, but his son was able to drag him right back to the garrison house. And then the natives tried to burn the garrison down, and the only reason Wheeler survived is he got lucky, and so did the others in the garrison. It started to rain and put the fires out. The Indians were trying to set the garrison aflame. So now you've got that big Winnamesset village filled with both Wampanoags and Nipmucks. Some stay in that Brookfield region, but others head up towards Deerfield, an area we call Turner's Falls. They call the Great Falls on the Connecticut River. And then they just start going down, the Connecticut River, attacking towns like Northampton and Hadley, culminating in the attack on Springfield. So in these early months of the war, the natives are actually winning. They're having one victory after another. The Mohawks stay out of it. They never join up with Metacom. And this is when probably one of the worst disasters for the English happens at Bloody Brook. They had sent a wagon train up because they knew Deerfield had been attacked and some survivors were holed up in the garrison, so they wanted to rescue the survivors, and they were expecting maybe, run into hostile natives, but nothing happened. So they got the survivors, and they even took the grain that was in these big sacks, put it all in the wagons. And here's a wood carving from that period of the attack. The natives were waiting on either hillside by Bloody Brook. It used to be called Muddy Brook. And maybe they knew that the wagon train was going to get stuck in the mud, but that's exactly what happened. And the soldiers bunched up on the trail, and then the natives opened fire. And it was a disaster. 76 English people were killed in this one one attack, and most of them, their remains are buried here on the town common in South Deerfield. So again, if you're ever out in Western Mass, say you're driving up 91 to Vermont, check out South Deerfield. It's a beautiful area. You can drive right up to the top of Mount Sugarloaf and get a great view of the Connecticut River. You're looking down on the little town of Sunderland. And it occurred to me when I was writing the books, you know, in some of these views, not much has changed in over 300 years, an isolated farm in the floodplain of the Connecticut River. So we're getting into winter now, and these two tribes control a good chunk of modern day Massachusetts. And then the colonists do something surprising. They attack a neutral tribe, and you'd go, why would they do that? Well, their thinking was the Narragansetts are the strongest tribe. They had intelligence that they might join up with Metacom. So they thought if we do a sneak attack, we can hit them before they even have a chance to join against us. Now, when I interviewed Narragansett historians, they said, that version is the English version. We were a neutral tribe. We had not attacked any towns, and they attacked our winter encampment and killed men, women, and children, like a Pearl Harbor sneak attack. So although the English called it a fight, because they did lose some militiamen, the natives never call it the Great Swamp Fight. They always call it the Great Swamp Massacre. But the soldiers, some were killed trying to get in. The natives would usually winter in places with palisaded walls to keep enemy tribes out and to keep wolves out during the winter. You know, we had wolves ranging all over Massachusetts like we do now with the coyotes. And so down in Charleston, Rhode Island, there is a big monolith to the Narragansett Nation, and then the stones around it are the attacking colonies. Benjamin Church was there, so we put in some of his diary in our King Phillips War history book, and I made him a character in Until I Have No Country. And he said that after we burned that village down, we had to go all the way back to the garrison that you see here, Smith's Castle it's called, and many of our wounded died by the time they got there. He said it was a blizzard going on and just a really difficult march. So there's still plenty of natives, though, out along the Connecticut River, and they decide, let's start hitting towns closer to Boston. And this is when they take Mary Rowlandson captive. She was the wife of the minister in Lancaster, and those dotted lines show her trail of captivity. She was a tough woman because she survived, I think it was off the top of my head, 10 or 11 weeks of being held captive, you know, with poor food. But she did say in her diary, she said the natives didn't have much food either because they've been so busy waging war, they weren't able to grow their crops that prior summer. So by winter, they were hungry. And it's one of the few times the natives were successful getting inside a garrison house. So Mary Rowlandson was just one of many taken captive by the natives, and eventually they ransomed her back to the English in exchange for money. And so I'm presuming that they would use, they being the hostile natives, would use the money to buy muskets from the French because, you know, they had a pretty good relationship with the French, and then later in history, they joined with the French during the French and Indian Wars to come back and get revenge against the English. But this is where she was released. It's called Redemption Rock in Princeton, a big, giant glacial erratic. You can see I'm standing at the top of it. And now they're getting closer and closer to Boston. They attack Medfield. We don't know where their encampment was at Mount Wachusett, but somewhere in that vicinity was a base of operations for the natives. And this is one of the oldest homes in Massachusetts. It was burned during King Phillips War and then rebuilt a year later. It's the Peak House in Medfield. And there's a story, and I'm not sure if it was the Peaks who lived there or the name of the house, but there was a farmer in that area who went to his barn the morning of the attack, saw a native, the outline of a leg, under the hay, and knew a native was hiding in his barn. He was going to stab and kill the native with his pitchfork, but then he thought, what if there's more than one? They're going to jump me. So he was pretty cool. He got out of there and woke his family up, and they all ran to the garrison. The garrison fired the cannon, and that was the signal for everybody to flee their homes that the natives were attacking. And so we've gone almost to the 1-year mark of the war. We're into April of 1676. And again, the natives are still having victories. At the Sudbury fight, they lure Wadsworth and his troops right into an ambush. You would think the English would have learned by now, but they didn't listen to Benjamin Church yet. And so in the spring, it really looks like the natives are going to drive the English into like a ring around Boston, like, say the Route 128 perimeter area, because you could see all the towns they've hit and burned. Providence was burned to the ground. So Roger Williams' grand experiment went up in flames. But in that same month are when things start to go bad for the natives. And in this slide, you see the Connecticut English are fighting with friendly Indians along their side, Niantics and Mohegans, and they kill the head of all the Narragansett's cannon shot. So the English are now turning the tide, and they're starting to win the battles. And I think a key reason, besides using friendly Indians to help them, was the other natives, the hostile natives, were starving. They just were not able to grow their crops. They were so busy being on the move and being hunted down. And Turner's Falls is the final straw that breaks the back of the native uprising. Captain Turner gets volunteers from towns like Hadley, Springfield, Northampton, and then he heads up, he's got intelligence of where the main encampment of Indians are at the Great Falls. And it was a big encampment used throughout the ages by Native Americans because they could catch salmon and shad going up the Connecticut River when they hit the waterfalls. And Turner's pretty smart. He doesn't just attack from the south. He curls around to the north. Some natives try to flee across the Connecticut River, but it's springtime and it's swollen. They're swept right over the falls. And you'll see Turner comes up from the south, tethers his horses, then curls around to the north, and then kind of has the villagers trapped in this bend in the Connecticut River. But he still, after he demolishes the native village, he's still got to get to safety, and some of the natives regroup and start following him, and on his retreat, Turner is killed. So even though Captain Turner is credited with the decisive blow against the natives, he does not survive that attack. So now most natives are going north. It's the only direction they can go because there's English in the south, there's English in the east, and in the west is an enemy tribe, the Mohawks. So most go north, but Metacom, we think, was at Mount Wachusett, and he goes south, probably knowing the war is lost, but wants to go back to Montauk or Mount Hope, a high place, to make his last stand. So that's why I put that in quotation. That's my interpretation of why he went down right back where there were a whole bunch of English, probably knew the cause was lost. And it was one of his own people who had turned traitor and joined up with Benjamin Church, who shot Metacom in the back. So when he's killed, they lose the main leader of this uprising. So if you're interested in the books, you can go to my website, and the last name is Tricky, Tougias. But there's a way for you to send me a note saying if you want the book personalized for a gift for holidays. And then this is my latest book. It's about growing up in Western Mass, and it's a story of my relationship with my father and how it evolved over time. This is a brand new book this summer. And I'm going to close the little talk on, the Pilgrims, the Mayflower, and King Philip on a positive note, because when I went to school, so I was in Longmeadow, Mass, one of the towns attacked, and yet they never taught us about King Philip's War. It's as if they swept the whole thing under the rug. I remember being a little kid and they're talking about, oh, Thanksgiving was wonderful. The Pilgrims were helped by the natives and they all sat down for a feast. And then the next thing you know, they jump ahead to the Revolution. What about all those years in between? They were filled with warfare. King Philip's War, Pequot War, French and Indian Wars later. And at least now they are teaching that in the school systems, rather than teaching just selective history. So we can open it up to questions or comments. I'll stop the screen share. I love the research. People always say, oh, wow, you've done so many books, you love the writing. I go, no, I don't like the writing. It's still hard work. But I love the research, and particularly going to these places where the battles happened and trying to get the feel of the landscape before you write about it.
Mm-hmm.
But questions or comments, I think you can unmute yourselves. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
It's such, one reason I think people don't know about King Philip's War is the name. It throws people off. You think, oh, it's something to do with the British, and it has nothing to do with England. It's all right here in the colonies. But you could use the chat room if you're not unmuted.
I think Roger has a question.
Yep.
Okay.
This is a wonderful presentation. I really appreciate it. And
Thank you.
I actually read your book on King Philip's War. So my question is, what is your sense of the population that existed, not just at the time of King Philip's War, when I understand that the population was more or less equal and very small, but in the preceding years, because there was a recent Harvard study about the peak population in New England of the so-called woodland culture, and it gave very small numbers, something like 30,000 people in the whole of New England. And I'm wondering what sense you got from all your historical research.
My sense was pretty close to that. I know, we used a really rough estimate during King Philip's War of maybe 20,000 Native Americans here and, the New England area. But my feeling is that the population was way higher than 30,000 when the Pilgrims first arrived, because there were so many waves of disease that they had no immunities to. They would die from smallpox, from measles, and there's just account after account of from the English talking about native villages just wiped out.
So not actually when the Pilgrims arrived, but before then you're referring to.
Before and during and even after. English accounts of, after the English were settled in towns like Springfield, talking about some native villages being really hit hard by disease. So their numbers were on a slow decline, right up to King Philip's War, and the English numbers were increasing because more and more are coming over and they're prospering. But to ever know the true figure, I don't think we'll ever know on either side, to be honest. Other questions or comments?
Can you hear me, Michael?
Yes.
Oh,
Hi.
I'm just intrigued to hear the story because I spent a lot of my life in Sudbury, and everywhere you go, there's monuments to King Philip and all that. I had no idea the war was a year and came
Right.
from Connecticut and Rhode Island and up to, I didn't know about middle of Massachusetts where you're from. I just kind of thought it was all just located in, the
Sudbury.
Sudbury area. So I appreciate it, and hopefully I'll get to read your books.
Yeah, Sudbury was a disaster for the English because the natives tricked them. What they did was they had a bunch of native warriors on either side of two hills. There's a hill called Green Hill and another one.
Sure.
And they just, you probably know it.
Well,
They just showed it.
all that area is covered with it. And
Yes.
You never know what is this monument about? Yeah. Yeah.
And what they did was they just showed a few of themselves to the soldiers, and the soldiers think, oh, just a small group of natives, let's get them. And they go running between these two hills and walk right into the trap.
Wow.
And Wadsworth, that name you'll see a lot in Sudbury.
Oh,
He was the leader.
absolutely. Everything's Wadsworth. Yeah, yeah.
Yep, he was the leader of the troops.
Yeah. That's interesting too, because remember what am I talking about? The Wadsworth, the inn in Sudbury. I thought maybe when I saw Wadsworth, it was all about the poet, but it actually had to do with the general, huh?
Yeah, yep. Yeah, and then you have the Wayside Inn there.
That Wayside Inn, yeah. And
Right.
that's Wadsworth, wrote the poem. And so I always think when I'm in Sudbury and I see Wadsworth, but it has to do with the military general in the King Phillips War. How intriguing.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
funny. Yeah.
And so that was in the spring. Yeah. And the war had been going on almost a year.
Yeah.
They say in casualty terms, when you consider the population on a per capita basis, that this war was more costly in terms of lives than even the Civil War. So more costly than any other war America's ever fought in on a per capita basis. So it was, devastating to the natives, and it was pretty tough on the colonists too. Years and years to recover, rebuild these settlements.
Wow.
Yeah, we put a little chart in the beginning of the King Philip's War history book, like comparing it to the Civil War and World War II when you do it on a per capita basis.
Michael, we have a question here, I think,
Yep.
down here. Go ahead.
Am I being heard?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi there.
Thank you for a most wonderful presentation and pictures.
Thank you.
And I agree. What I didn't learn and what I did learn in school, I'm trying to pick it up now. I hope I have a few days left. In any event, you have a class of cultures. And what insights into human nature did you see in those people, or you yourself see? And are we just repeating history over and over again? And can human instinct and
Right. Yeah, to me, the message that comes through loud and clear was greed, the going after land any way possible, and misunderstandings between the cultures. I'll give an example. If you're a Native American, you're part of a communal group. You don't own like one little plot of land, but sometimes a native would want the money and he'd say, okay, I'm selling, 100 acres here. It really wasn't his to sell. And when they're selling it, they didn't have the concept of ownership like we do. I live on an acre lot. This is my acre. You can't come hunting here unless you get permission. They're thinking they're just selling it to the English that they could, build there and farm there, but not that we, the natives, can't walk through there or can't hunt there. So their whole concept of land and community is very different. So, off the top of my head, those are the kind of the things that stick with me, that hunger for land from the settlers, and then this total different viewpoint and misunderstanding of the two cultures. Yeah, kind of sad on human nature. Here's one. I heard a fragment of a radio interview about King Philip's War, and his head was put on a pike. Yes. After the English killed him, Benjamin Church cut his head off, brought it to Plymouth, put it on top of a pole where it stayed for like 25 years. And there's even more gory parts as well. But that's true. Yes, that's most definitely true. Wow, look at all the participants we got at the tail end. We're up to 30. That's incredible.
Yeah. I think we're at 32 in the middle.
Wow.
So that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, because we started, it was very small. So
yes, it was. It's great.
thank you.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question, possibly right here.
Me?
Yep.
Okay. I wanted to speak up for the native, not the native, but the English who were living there. I grew up out in Western Massachusetts.
What town?
Right outside of Northampton.
Okay, yeah.
And my relatives, my ancestors, all were in that area. My sister-in-law did a study of genealogy going back to trace my family. And she tells a story about an aunt that I had as an ancestor who was living, she thought, peacefully in a little community outside of Deerfield.
Yep.
And the story goes that her husband and brother had to go into the woods at one occasion to do something in the woods. I'm not sure what it was, but they always had the feeling that to be safe, they had to go in a group. They couldn't go separately into the woods. At one point, my aunt goes out to bring a message to them, and she's caught by the Indians and scalped. She survives the attack, but for the rest of her life, of course, she's never normal again. And the story goes that she's put on public welfare as a way of trying to help her to survive after that. So the fact of the terror that was felt among the people who lived in those areas was very real. And so they might have been usurpers of the land, but they were also victims of those wars.
Absolutely. It had to be terrifying for everybody. You know, during the war, you never knew where an attack was going to happen on either side. And you're right, like one of the first towns along the Connecticut River to be destroyed was Northfield, right above Deerfield. And then Deerfield was next, and they kind of like made their way right down the river, attacking towns in the early part of the war when they were successful.
Yeah. By the way, your talk was excellent. It was really wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was great to see. You know, I never knew there were so many people tuned in until I looked at the bottom of the screen. So that's fantastic.
It is. Yeah.
People love the history, you know, it's just. And so the King Philip's War book with Eric Schultz that I did is the history of the war. It's a big book, 350 pages. But Until I Have No Country is a little shorter, and there's two main characters. One is a colonial settler named John Homer, and one is a Native American named Tamaset. And so it kind of shows it from both perspectives, just as, we just talked about, just brutal on both sides.
I don't see any other questions. Are there? Do you, Michael?
No,
I have one.
Oh, okay. Yep.
There's one in the chat.
Yeah, there is one in the chat from Martha. We need to look at also.
Well, my question is the reputation of King Philip, as he was called. In my reading, it seems like very shortly after the war, maybe within 10 years, he was being written about favorably by Europeans or people of European ancestry. And I wondered what that represented, because it seems to me unusual that an enemy would be regarded favorably so quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, I had not seen that favorably. In fact, I saw the opposite time and again. They would say that this was God's way of punishing us, the colonists, for straying off, our religious path, and they sent these devils led by King Philip. They never called him Metacom. So, they equated him to the devil, and this was God's wrath to punish the Puritans and the Pilgrims. There's another question here. It was in the chat. Someone said,
Yeah.
were natives given smallpox contaminated blankets on Deer Island, or is that a rumor? I think that might be a rumor. I don't think they intentionally did that, but they certainly didn't give them enough shelter and food on Deer Island. Many of those natives who were interned there died. Some, just to get out of there, became scouts for the English. But who could blame them? I'd want to get out of there too. Well, thank you, Vera.
Well, thank you, Michael, for an excellent presentation.
Yeah, and Maria,
And
thank you.
Yes, once again, we would like to thank the John and Mary Murphy Foundation, whose generous grant made this possible. So thank you again, Michael. We hope to see you again soon.
That sounds good. Everybody enjoy this nice sunshine today.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Did you get off?